I wasn't planning on covering the reboot at first. It was really mid, and I couldn't stand the thought of having to watch it again. Besides, my favorite YouTuber mentioned offhand in a stream that he was considering on reviewing it. Well, that never panned out, so I did some digging to see what their consensus was, and I was shocked. People love this. I cannot fathom for the life of me how people, especially fans of the original, can stomach this absolute bottom-of-the-barrel slop masquerading as King of the Hill. Granted, a lot of the posts and articles glazing it are probably bots, whether in the literal sense or in the sense that they're soulless golems with no taste. But still, there's a ton to hate about this reboot, not just in terms of comparisons to the original, but on its own merits. TLDR, it's boring, unfunny, poorly structured, woke, and honestly really ugly looking in terms of the animation. I did a few YouTube shorts on it, but I think it's about time I finally get down to brass tacks and tear apart this trash. King of the Hill was a show I grew up watching. Partially because that and The Simpsons were the only adult animated shows my parents would let me watch, and The Simpsons had nowhere near the consistent quality that King of the Hill did. I must have seen every episode multiple times, and it stayed with me. I'd go back to it every year or so and just relive some of my favorite episodes. Lupe's Revenge, Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret Hill, and The Perils of Poland come to mind as some of the highlights. I'm not going to call it a comfort show because that's cringe, but I would say that yeah, the show had a certain coziness to it that made me feel happy. And at a strong moral center above all else. Hank and the majority of the cast were, at the end of the day, upstanding people who wanted to do the right thing in spite of their flaws. There are plenty of manipulative or greedy people that were trying to screw them over, but they always got their comeuppance at the end of the day, and the heroes never really had to stoop to their level to do so. If you're curious about the reboot, you've probably already seen the original, but I do want to lay the groundwork on the show's philosophy and outlook so I can really illustrate how this reboot fails. The so-called 14th season, it's irritating, overly cynical, fundamentally misunderstands the characters, and overall is flat out demoralizing. If you like the original, or even just the kind of cozy Americana light vibe the original show was going for, this reboot will absolutely infuriate you, and considering the direction media production has taken lately, this is almost certainly intentional. And no matter how many call this the best reboot ever, or a return to form, or some variation of that, it's slop, plain and simple. Quality-wise, it's awful. One thing you'll notice is that very few plots have a solid grasp of story structure. You know this graph you probably had to learn in language arts? Yeah, it has this section for rising actions, as in scenes and events that push the characters further from where they began and closer to the climax of the story. The reboot consistently neglects to include these, though. I'll use episode 2 as an example. Hank and Bobby have a fundamental disagreement on what beer should be like, so they go head-to-head in a homebrewing competition. They reach this disagreement just a few minutes into this episode, and it's unceremoniously resolved 20 minutes later. Everything in between, it's basically just the characters sitting with this conflict without it growing or developing in any way, i.e. there aren't any rising actions. You could cut out everything in the middle, and the episode would be pretty much functionally identical. And a lot of the plots are like this. The conflict is established, 20 minutes of nothing happens, and then it's magically resolved. It makes each episode absolutely painful to sit through, especially with how unfunny they are. King of the Hill's humor could be really subtle and understated in the original at times, and it's part of why it was so chill. The show trusted the audience to pick up on the humor without it being in your face like Family Guy or something. The reboot lacks this subtlety though, with pretty much every joke coming across like, well, a joke rather than being woven into the dialogue with any sort of grace. It's also a lot raunchier than the original, which is already a bit weird tonally, but also supports my theory that they had to dumb down the humor by removing any subtlety. Well, that's half of the humor at least. The other half is just using modern slang or terminology and thinking that constitutes comedy. It doesn't, but the writers clearly disagree with me there, so expect to hear terms like nepo baby, internalized misogyny, Reddit, and FOMO without any further elaboration. The joke is that the characters are saying a contemporary word or phrase. There's no commentary on it or anything, it's just modern word exists, laugh. That's a common theme with this show. There'll be contemporary things like Uber, all-gender bathrooms, Zoom, but the show absolutely refuses to take a stance on these things. The first episode is by far the worst offender, presumably because they wanted to make sure everyone could, right off the rip, see how modern and contemporary the reboot is. Like, we see Hank confused by a set of bathrooms until someone explains they're both gender neutral. That's it. I'm not saying the show needs to validate every single one of my beliefs, but it needs to say something, right? Does Hank hate them? Does he like them? Anything? Simply describing something that exists in 2025 isn't funny or interesting. It just comes across like a show terrified of offending someone while also being simultaneously terrified of not acknowledging how the world has changed. And these are all surface level references, by the way. Putting aside the characters being aged up, a lot, over half of these plots would be completely possible in the original too. Creating a little backyard library, trying to catch a rat in a restaurant, entering a homebrewing competition. I'm not saying there needs to be or even should be an episode where Bobby uses TikTok or something, but it's weird that the show tries so hard to pay lip service to being in 2025, but rarely ever ties its stories to the present. I mean that from a storytelling perspective, by the way. The visuals, yeah, the visuals definitely look like something out of the present, by which I mean it looks like a cheap Flash animation. The animation style got a huge downgrade. I won't dwell on this for too long because basically everyone who cares about animation will agree and everyone who doesn't won't, but the animation is extremely stiff, especially when the characters are walking parallel to or perpendicular to the camera, which happens quite often. Also, the reboot lacks the dramatic or unusually composed shots of the original, so get used to seeing the same angles and same backgrounds over and over again. Mercifully, we only have to see whatever this is meant to be once. So you're probably wondering, is the reboot woke? Yep. And no, despite what a lot of midwits will argue, the original wasn't woke either. It never tried to force progressive leftist politics down the viewer's throat. And I wouldn't call it conservative either. If anything, the show is just very moderate. Corporate greed bad, respecting others good, very basic. But these universal morals are part of why the show is so cozy. The original show is already pretty diverse, so how would the reboot making it more diverse be woke? A good example is what Kahn's anniversary party hosted at Nine Rivers Country Club looks like. Yeah, it's no longer all Asian. There's an entire episode in the original about this exact country club, explaining why using minorities for diversity brownie points is bad. The showrunners are unironically doing the exact same thing that the original show criticized. Something I'll cover a bit more in depth in this video are the new voice actors for Kahn and Ted, both of which were voiced by a white guy, which is obviously verboten in this day and age. Yeah, they've been voiced for over a dozen seasons by this guy, and the reboot pissed that away in the name of political correctness. Another diverse change was the addition of a new black character named Brian, at least in the first episode. Like most details that get established in episode 1, he doesn't really come up after that. Not for lack of trying though, because they just squeeze him into the core cast and have someone throw out a line like, wow, it's just like it's always been. I mean, it's one thing to introduce a new character, but specifically to try to do it's like nothing's changed, makes it feel extremely politically motivated. It's like they don't want us to notice or even question it, just to accept that this new black guy is here, that he might as well have always been here. One change I guarantee the normies failed to notice is that Hank isn't really a Methodist anymore. While it didn't come up in every episode in the original, it is an integral part of his character. It was something his beliefs reflected, and it was even part of one of the funniest jokes in the original. The reboot has religion mentioned twice from what I could find, once by the Hispanic chef at Bobby's restaurant, and again by the villain of episode 9 who later gets humiliated. And maybe you disagree that its omission means anything, but what about Hank's time in Saudi Arabia? Yeah, we have this Christian couple choosing to spend years working in Saudi Arabia, and yes, Peggy does wear a burqa, which is pretty fucking demoralizing to see, by the way, and Hank even comments on how much he likes the conservative Muslim garbs. I imagine a lot of us know what the show is doing here. I'm not going to say it, but if you know, you know. What else is woke? Lots of strong females, many notable couples, a consistent belittling of men when the reverse never happens. You know, of course, part of that woke ideology is denigrating the characters in media you respected and enjoyed, and the reboot has this in spades. Bill has been made even more pathetic with all of his redeeming traits being removed. Boomhauer is now a cuck in the absolute most literal sense of the word, as in a man raising the child of his lover and another man. And Hank, it's the first time we see him, he's literally getting a humiliation ritual. No, I'm not kidding. His narrow urethra was always the source of jokes in the original, and they were funny, but this is way different tonally, and considering what the rest of the season is like, I'm not going to give the writers the benefit of the doubt here. And the plots? Get ready for such woke messages as social connections online are way better than meeting in person, the male loneliness epidemic is solely the fault of men and not women, and progressivism is what gives America its identity. No, I'm not joking. When I say the show is demoralizing, I mean it. One thing you'll hear come up time and time again is that Hank and Peggy no longer feel they have purpose or meaning in their lives now that they've retired. Bobby doesn't have it much better either. He now works overtime at a restaurant for his romantic rival, you know, Chane from the original series. Yeah, and Chane is together with Connie now. There's not really a reason why, since she always hated him in the original run. Besides that, you also get other demoralizing plot points like Kahn getting divorced and sleeping in the garage, Peggy trying to get in touch with Bobby who no longer has any time for her, and well, pretty much everything they did with Connie's character. It's just depressing and uncomfortable. Obviously the characters were going to change as a result of the whole time skip angle, but are any of them really happier than they were before? The only ones I can think of who are happier are Chane, Ted, and Buck Strickland, all of which were selfish assholes who routinely made the lives of people around them miserable. Remember how I said that the original had a strong moral center? Yeah, the reboot is a lot less cozy right off the bat. King of the Hill was always a really uplifting, positive show, so seeing its characters be beaten down and creating just such a cynical mood is uncomfortable. It doesn't fit what the original show was going for, and even on its own merits, it's just too unpleasant. Anyway, since it's only 10 episodes and I have something to say about most of them, I guess I'll cover each one individually. Timestamps are in the description if you don't want to hear me yap. Alright, here we go. So, Return of the King, the grand return of a beloved fictional Texan family. And how does it begin? And I already said this earlier, but it begins with the patriarch of the house getting what amounts to a humiliation ritual. I won't say it's not funny, I did chuckle, but it's really an odd shift tonally from the original. And I do question the motives of some of the team behind the reboot, but I digress. Hank and Peggy arrive in Texas after spending a few years in Saudi Arabia. The culture shock here is the main plot, with Hank having a lot of trouble adjusting to the new 2025 America. Gender-neutral bathrooms, bike lanes, electric cars, and stuff like that. He gets a drive home from his Arabic Uber driver and then gets another smaller humiliation ritual in the form of a bad review. And then he gets to meet up with the rest of the Rainy Street guys and see what they've been up to in the 9 or so years since the original. Like I said, Boomhauer is investing parental efforts in a juvenile who is not genetically his offspring. Which is the biological definition of a cuckold, by the way. And the offspring is called Luke Jr., and he has post-COVID paranoia and still wears a face mask. Next, Hank meets Bill, who really let himself go, not having left his home in 5 years. His hair isn't gray, by the way, it's just the color grading that makes it look like that for some reason. Anyway, he explains that in the interim, he watched all of Netflix, which would include all of One Piece, that terrible Resident Evil show, Cocomelon, Cuties. Yeah, you can make a whole number of observations about that line. Go wild. Next, Dale emerges from a trash barrel for some reason and talks about how he was the mayor of Arlen. Know how I said the show will acknowledge contemporary issues while deliberately avoiding making any sort of statement on them? Here's a perfect example. Dale, as you might imagine, ran on an anti-mask platform during COVID. So, to avoid having the characters react to this and risk taking a side on the issue, they make Dale's stance anti-masks, anti-COVID masks, catcher's masks, gas masks, basically making it so ridiculous and detached from real discourse that the characters can safely chide him without needing to be either for or against the COVID mask mandate bullshit. Which leads me to ask, why even bring up contentious political issues if you're so opposed to having characters take sides? Anyway, Hank tries to see if Dale could get the bike lanes removed, but Dale explains that he can't since he's an election denier, by which I mean he denied the result of his own election and resigned. Oh, there's also Brian Robertson, who lived in the house when Hank was away. This is about when we get that line that he fits right in and it's like the same old or whatever. Again, I don't care about new characters being introduced, especially after a 9-year time skip. When you try to frame it like nothing has changed, it really starts to make me question your motives and piss me off. Now seeing not just how America has changed, but Arlen and his friends too, Hank seriously considers returning to Saudi Arabia. Oh yeah, and during that flashback, we get the scene with Peggy in a burqa haggling at a market. Well, she thinks she's haggling. In actuality, she's shortchanging the Muslim guy who, let's be real, if the show is realistic, would not just yell at her for doing that. But it would be a very, very different show if they gave him a realistic reaction. Hank gives a rather horrible line about preferring Peggy wearing the burqa. Anyway, so when he lived there, he lived in a gated community that he described as looking like 1950s America. You know, more America than the Texas of today, according to him. He goes to a store with Peggy, and we get this legitimately demoralizing scene of the two holding hands and walking depressedly into the store, no longer feeling like they have a place in this country. Hank sees Girl Scouts selling cookies. He says the word metaverse for some reason.
Metaverse.
No, there's no impetus for that. And asks about Samoas and learns that they were renamed to Caramel Delights for political correctness reasons. All of a sudden, something within Hank snaps. The Bezmenov-style demoralization campaign has finally reached its conclusion, and he metamorphosizes into a bugman, fully accepting of the woke ideology and deciding that he should stay. America's identity is progressivism, so the America of today is still as America as ever. Well, that's my headcanon anyway. The Caramel Delights being renamed does convince Hank to stay for some reason, but there's no actual explanation. You're more than welcome to accept my reasoning as canon. And that's the end of the A-plot. It ends very unceremoniously. As for Bobby's side of things, it's also pretty bare bones. It's mainly a bunch of unrelated scenes to explain what Bobby and his restaurant are like now. This is where we learn that he's working under Chain Wasana Song at a restaurant alongside his wise and flawless head chef named Emilio. He meets some college students and explains that he felt like it would be a waste of time and money to attend college himself. Based. And then he hooks up with his progressive-looking college chick while Peggy listens to the two snogging. Or no, really. Choker reveals she just wanted a one-night stand, which disappoints Bobby until he sees Connie, clearly not aware of what the upcoming episodes turn her into. He also mentions offhand that Joseph is his roommate. And believe it or not, that's pretty much it to this episode. The vast majority of the runtime is devoted to establishing how different the world is compared to when King of the Hill first aired. So plot and humor really take a back seat. A better show could have incorporated both, telling a compelling story while also laying the groundwork for the setting, but alas, this is not a better show. Well, at least the plot threads are set up right. Now we can get episodes about Dale's prior mayoral work, or Bill getting rehabilitated, or Boomhauer raising Luke Jr., or anything with Brian Robertson, or maybe Nancy and John Redcord's YouTube channel I forgot to mention, or... Wait, none of these things come up again? Yeah, I was shocked too when I first watched the season. I'm not sure if maybe there were plans for episodes about these plot points at one stage in development, but in the remaining 9 episodes, the only thing that gets followed up on, and I'm really stretching it here, is Boomhauer raising Luke Jr., which gets a whole 60 seconds of screen time in the next episode. I'm sure you're really understanding what I said earlier now. This show wants to make a huge deal about how different things are now, but when push comes to shove, it's actually incredibly afraid to engage with anything new or different. This episode is already dull, but knowing that all this groundwork amounts to literally nothing makes it just painful to sit through, man. I don't want to come across like I'm not giving the show a chance, because I did, even though I was definitely expecting garbage. So here's my concession. I'll find the funniest joke of every episode and include it in my review, and you can come to your own conclusions. For this episode, my favorite joke was the circumstances in which Dale won the election, and especially the photo of him accepting his very paltry victory.
I won with a simple plurality of 9%.
After feeling directionless post-retirement, Hank ends up getting into homebrewing. Keep that framing device in mind because this is far from the only time we'll see it. Bobby, with his more metropolitan perspective on beer, ends up competing against Hank in a homebrewing competition, with each hill getting unhelpful advice about their beer. Bobby asks Chain's friends for advice, and Hank asks his own friends, and even visits a hipster beer bar with a sign that says Riz for some reason. And the beer they sell there tells stories. Finally, the competition rolls around and both hills present their beers. There's a line that could have been funny where the judge asks Hank himself what story the beer is telling since beer can't talk, but something about the execution made it more irritating than funny. Anyway, they both resign from the contest, coming to a mutual understanding. Of all the episodes, this is one of the most boring. It probably sounds like my summary was extremely condensed, but there really wasn't a whole lot happening. The conflict arose way too quickly. The moment Hank and Bobby start discussing beer, they already reach a fundamental disagreement in how they view it. They don't split up because of creative differences partway through or anything that would have made for a more interesting plot. They just start off already opposed. And the way it resolves is also incredibly sudden. There isn't like a gradual shift where Hank and Bobby start to realize the other one might have a point. It just all happens at once at the very end. Maybe this plot could have had some sort of emotional center, but when every single plot beat happens with zero build-up and no warning, it fails at making me feel anything. The episode tries to make it a sort of generation gap thing by introducing a Dale-Joseph rivalry where they're both trying to manipulate the contest judges, but it only really gets 2 scenes and it's dropped rather unceremoniously. Oh, and Hank has an incredibly subdued and out-of-character reaction when he believes Dale is offering to kill Bobby. You're telling me Hank wouldn't at the very least threaten to kick his ass for that? There's another half-baked subplot consisting of 4 short moments where Luke Jr. gets addicted to non-alcoholic beer. I say that with very heavy air quotes because while it would be funny if he started acting like an alcoholic, that never actually happens, and it's really just told as opposed to shown. The episode already has enough trouble balancing the plots and themes, so I have no clue why they tried to insert something so unfunny into an already overstuffed episode. There's a similar episode in the original run where Hank and Bobby compete against each other in ways that reflect their own worldview and perspective, and that was called Dances with Dogs. Besides just being funnier, it also works better as a TV episode because it understands the medium. We can see with our own eyes how the costuming and choreography reflects Bobby and Hank. Obviously we can't taste the beer in the episode, so it's all conveyed through other characters describing it. The sense of taste doesn't exist in this medium, obviously, so the competition lacks emotional stakes since there's nothing perceptibly Bobby about his beer, just as there's nothing perceptibly Hank about his. Boring, and despite seeming to have way too many plot threads going on, it feels like nothing happens. The best line was Hank asking what old gun flavor could mean.
What's old gun flavor?
Ask Bill. He's the only one who's ever put a gun in his mouth.
It tasted like I thought it would.
I already made a YouTube short about this one, and to be honest, I didn't really leave much of the main plot out. Much like the beer story, it introduces a primary conflict early on, does little to change the stakes or build towards the conclusion, and then just suddenly resolves. That being said, I'll go over it again. Bobby needs to buy more specialized Japanese charcoal for his restaurant, but the supplier refuses to sell to him because he's white. He goes to speak with him in person and doesn't realize he's the owner despite having heard his voice presumably like an hour ago. The black guy explains that he's Japanese since he was adopted by two Japanese parents named Makoto and Junko. Even though he's being a total ass, the show portrays him as the rational one, with Chain flipping his lid and Bobby being weirdly condescending. Then Bobby goes to an Italian restaurant to see if they know where to get normal charcoal. Not sure why he couldn't just go to a Home Depot or something, but whatever. The Italians start crashing out and threatening Bobby mafia style. Then he's back at the restaurant. Some German Americans show up and tell him that he shouldn't serve German food if he doesn't have pure German blood. One of them is descended from a Nazi that Cotton killed. I had a whole spiel about this, but I'll just say this. Even though the original is pretty solid on the fact that Cotton fought in the Pacific Theater during the war, it's far from consistent. He was definitely portrayed as having fought in Germany too. Anyway, Bobby cooks for everyone and the Blackanese guy from earlier is there for some reason. Everyone loves his food and they agree not to scrutinize his cultural cooking anymore. I said it pretty succinctly in my short. This is taking what's very much a woke anti-racist issue and framing it as if it's some weird cultural conservatism or eugenics thing. It's not. The ones screeching about cultural appropriation have always been leftists whining about white people wearing kimonos, or selling tacos, or dressing their Animal Crossing character wrong, or having dreadlocks. Not that I understand why anyone would want to have dreadlocks. There's the same people who say that Europeans don't have culture, or they believe they do. They say it's okay for others to appropriate it, as long as the reverse doesn't happen. And the ending? Yeah, the real people who cry cultural appropriation would never forgive Bobby for being authentic and respectful. It's not about authenticity or respect to them. It's about control and trying to stick it to Whitey. That's all it's ever been about. Also, bear in mind that the ones threatening Bobby and demanding ethnic purity were all white. The black guy demonstrated himself as someone knowledgeable and respectful. Again, it's trying to spin this as some sort of white person issue, and while plenty of white leftists like to get in on the action, in real life this is done exclusively on the behalf of non-white people. There's also a bit of a revealing moment when Bobby is talking to his head chef about cultural appropriation. Firstly, he says that Speedy Gonzalez is racist, and then the chef complains that him being voiced by a white guy took jobs away from Latinos. Want to know why I know this isn't supposed to be a joke? The Reboot team did the exact same thing with Kana and Ted, replacing the white guy who voiced them in the name of cultural sensitivity. And don't worry, I'll get into that a lot more in the Khan episode. Whew, okay, now time for the B plot. They at least try to tie it into the main plot with this through line of authenticity, but it falls flat for me. Hank, Peggy, Nancy, and Dale go to some sort of George Bush museum. No clue if that's a real thing or not. Anyway, Dale shares conspiracy theories which the Chore group prefers to the facts. It really made me realize that the writers can't, or more likely choose not to, write Dale correctly. In the original he was neurotic, sure, but not this overtly. One thing you'll notice about the reboot is that it pretty much reduced him to conspiracy theories and exterminating, and then it drives those 2 points into the ground. In recent decades, there's been a concerted effort to paint conspiracy theories as inherently right-wing and all sorts of other negative buzzwords associated with that. So now you can't write a character who believes in conspiracy theories while also being a loyal husband, a loving father, and a generally good-hearted friend. No, Reddit told me that conspiracy theorists are dangerous and bigoted. Why would you portray someone like that positively? So that's why Dale has been reduced to his two most surface-level traits, with pretty much everything else dropped. I'm surprised one of the other conspiracy theories guys name dropped Rockefeller, though. That did surprise me, I guess. Yeah, this episode is just irritating how disingenuous it is. You know an episode sucks when the best line in it is someone asking if they can roleplay as Jeffrey Epstein.
Can I be Epstein?
Hank and Peggy are watching a reality show with this couple and are feeling directionless now that they've retired. Yeah, again. Hank's purposelessness is solved when Boomhauer shows him a sort of workman-for-hire app called Chore Chimp. Boomhauer gets hurt on the job and Hank takes over, only to get a poor rating because the Chore Chimp customers want to talk to people and not have their chores done. I mean, this premise already doesn't make sense to me. Would people really want to get advice from their repairman? I mean, for me, it's bad enough letting a handyman into my house, but talking to them and asking for advice sounds hellish. Maybe someone more socially adept can correct me, but this plot makes no sense to me. Actually, there's another episode later on with a whole subplot about how people don't want social interaction nowadays, so which is it? Anyway, Hank finds out the young couple wanted advice, and after he gets his bad review, he returns to give them some. The wife was having trouble breastfeeding, so he tells her about how Peggy had that issue too. Then he gets a 5-star rating and for some reason goes back to thinking it was solely because of his work, presumably because the next scene wouldn't happen otherwise. He gets a video sent from them, which he believes is about the grouting, only to find out it's about the anecdote he shared about Peggy. Peggy gets upset, understandably so, but the plot sort of takes a weird turn when she explains that she's not upset that her personal details were exposed to a stranger, but rather that it was her personal experiences and not Hank's that he shared. She wanted him to talk about his own experience and speak from the heart. This argument could have made sense, I guess, but pretty much the only thing the mom was talking about was breastfeeding, so what personal experience could Hank share? So yeah, we get a weird Hank-Peggy relationship crisis plot in the latter half of this episode that just sort of fizzles out. The B plot, this is where Chain and Kanye are revealed to be in a relationship. She invited Bobby to sing a love ballad together without Chain there. They even use a clip from the original show. But oh, surprise, Connie doesn't like Bobby that way. She just wanted to introduce him to this character who is Connie's roommate to have a one-night stand, but she never shows up after this, so I have no clue. I hope the intent isn't for us to think Bobby was reading too much into it, because that's not at all how it comes across. It just seems like Connie is leading him on and being a colossal bitch. Nothing more really comes of the B-plot, by the way, at least nothing I can remember, even having watched this a few times. Also, Bobby is no longer the Rizzler he was in the original. He now struggles to put together a text message without sounding awkward. Oh, wowie zowie. Sorry guys, but I tried and really couldn't find anything funny in this episode. To make it up to you, here's a joke I made myself that's way funnier. Chore chimp, huh? I guess that's what they're calling them these days. Hank now likes soccer because he saw a lush, well-maintained soccer field in Saudi Arabia. I'll just get this out of the way right now, that is not in character. It's not like he didn't know soccer fields could be great. He's seen them before in the show. If anything, he'd probably complain that playing soccer is a waste of a perfectly good sports field. But whatever, you like soccer now. And he takes over reffing at Boomhauer's girlfriend's son's soccer game after the soccer players get too heated and go after Boomhauer, I guess. After this point, the episode never tries to portray reffing soccer as especially difficult or dangerous, and Hank definitely doesn't have to deal with combative players, but whatever. He continues reffing for a while, and he even ends up chosen to referee for a game involving the mayor's son. Yes, the mayor is a woman, did you seriously expect anything else? Peggy finds this very sexy, with liking soccer sort of making Hank a bad boy. I guess this is meant to serve as further encouragement for Hank to stick with it, but the episode would have been better off if this was the only reason. Like, if Hank felt disgusted having to ref soccer, but also enjoyed feeling like a bad boy with Peggy. To Dale, Hank's newfound love of soccer is proof of him having been brainwashed to be a spy for a certain Middle Eastern country and their globalist agenda. Saudi Arabia, I mean, not that other one. He ends up kidnapping Hank right before Big Game, who is somehow unable to fight off Dale despite consistently being physically superior. He gets taken back to Dale's basement and nearly ends up on the receiving end of a truth serum made with a recipe from the dark web. Hank manages to convince Dale he's actually a double agent, earning his trust once again. He rushes to the game, but by the time he gets there, Boomhauer has, for whatever reason, decided to ref again. I don't know. With him reffing, the game ends up becoming a lot more like football with some wrestling thrown in. Hank and Peggy walk away acknowledging that Arlen isn't ready for soccer yet. Now for the B-plot, easily one of the worst in the season. Bobby goes to buy a car, does a great job at negotiating, and even gets it at the price he wanted. Then the owner or boss or whatever shows up and manages to convince Bobby to adopt a horse. And he does. Yet literally a Simpsons plot. They don't really do anything funny with it either. It gets a few scenes before Kami suggests they give the horse to John Redcorn, and he takes it off their hands, on the condition that Joseph visit him and the horse occasionally. I don't think I really need to explain why this kind of plot doesn't fit King of the Hill, but I do feel like I should voice my confusion with it. Firstly, I don't understand why Bobby was targeted. Was the owner trying to get him back for getting a good deal on a car? Or did he think Bobby was naive despite seeming to have a ton of business savvy? Besides that, Bronco Barry says that it costs a ton of money to dispose of a horse, but the guy is clearly not above underhanded methods. Was trying to convince someone in the Dallas region to adopt a horse seriously easier than just abandoning him in the wilderness or burying him in a shallow grave off of an interstate? King of the Hill is generally a pretty grounded world, so when you have a completely off-the-wall plot like this, it's incredibly conspicuous, and it makes me feel like I'm watching a totally different show. Not a good episode at all, probably one of the worst. The best line was when Hank speaks the truth about a horrible trend in women's hairstyling.
Although I still don't like women shaving their heads and dyeing what's left, they look like fruit.
This is probably my favorite episode of the season, which isn't saying much, but there you go. We start with Hank and Peggy. The I don't know what to do with retirement angle is brought up again. This time it's Peggy saying it, which I guess is something. She's feeling like her life has been boring and unfulfilling, so she applies to work at a community college or something. Meanwhile, Hank visits Bill at work, and no, Bill no longer works as an army barber. The show never elaborates beyond saying he was forced to retire. Anyway, he now works at a black barber shop owned by Brian's black cousin or something. Get used to hearing the word black a lot, because the writers thought that alone was hilarious. Black community, black cousin, black barber. I think they wanted to make a joke about how out of place Bill is, but they're too worried about offending people, so they can't actually acknowledge any differences exist between races or cultures. So what we end up with is a weird, safe attempt at comedy where a basic clinical description is meant to carry the humor. Anyway, Bill reveals that he's been telling the other black barbers that Peggy's his wife, and sort of describing Hank how Hank would describe Bill. He talks about these fabulous exploits he had with Peggy, like traveling, vacationing, and stuff. Obviously, Hank is disgusted by this. When Hank tells Peggy, she's enthralled by this fantastical version of herself and wonders if black barbershop Peggy would have gotten the community college job. Hank makes a very toothless acknowledgement of affirmative action as something that may or may not exist. And then Peggy goes to talk to Bill. She realizes pretty quickly that Bill's fantasy is unhealthy, so she demands he end it. Well, he does. He tells Everett at the barbershop that Peggy died, and they show up to his home for a sort of remembrance service. Peggy was going to reveal the truth, but she stops outside the back door and listens in. So this scene is probably the best in the reboot. Bill has a surprisingly well-done speech where he explains why he loves Peggy and her accomplishments, actual accomplishments from the original series too. It wraps Bill and Peggy's conflict up quite nicely. Peggy stops feeling like she hasn't done anything meaningful, and Bill gets to speak frankly about what he sees in Peggy and sort of comes to terms with letting her go, in the context of her passing, or her imaginary passing in the funeral, but also, accepting that it was just a fantasy, not reality. Peggy is one of my favorite King of the Hill characters, and yeah, even though the reboot sucks balls, I'll admit the scene did get me a little emotional when I first saw it. That being said, they gave Bill the Dale treatment, which is to say they reduced him to his surface-level traits and scrubbed off any nuance he had. Bill definitely thirsted after Peggy in the original, definitely some weird ways too, but that's pretty much all he's retained. His past as a football player or an army recruit never comes up. We don't really get to see the loyalty and gentleness he could show in the original either. Obviously, he's not as bad as he was in the first episode of the reboot, but that's really not saying much. The side plot is all over the place. It begins with Bobby putting together an audition tape for a reality show called King of the Grill. Yeah, they try to get cute with their little meta reference and say it was stupidly taken off the air a few decades ago, but don't think it actually becomes a statement on the actual reboot or anything. We never actually see the show or hear how Bobby's audition tape was received. It gets mentioned right at the beginning, and I think one or two offhand remarks later. It goes nowhere is what I'm saying. There's a rat in the kitchen, which Bobby needs taken care of in advance of the King of the Grill stuff that never actually materializes. He hires Dale, who brings in a second rat rigged with explosives, and then later a third rat he calls Sexy Rat to get the other one to lower his guard. Dale trying to catch the rat is what carries the Robota chain subplot. The other part of it, Bobby discussing open relationships with Connie, is just miserable. Connie, and I can't stress this enough, was made utterly insufferable in this reboot, but especially here, explaining how sleeping around in an open relationship is actually empowering. I mean, I guess it's truth in fiction, though. An intelligent girl with a bright future gets turned into an awful liberal in college. But yeah, what an awful way to write a character who is generally a lot more wise and responsible than her peers. Then this, I guess, romantic rival is introduced named Willow, whose first word on screen is the word shit. Keep that in mind. She comes back to Bobby's apartment and sleeps over in the bathtub. She accidentally gets kind of based by saying that college is a scam, that open relationships are just an excuse for being a slut. Wouldn't have expected that out of a female with dyed hair, a side shave, and piercings, but okay. Back at the restaurant, Dale finally catches the rats with the two male rats, too distracted by Sexy Rat to avoid capture. I think it's supposed to be some sort of moral. Bobby settled for being friends with Connie while she dates Chain and has a happy ending, while the two rats endlessly pursued Sexy Rat and ended up captured. I don't know, it's clear they had some sort of metaphor in mind, but I don't get exactly how it's supposed to fit in with the rest of the episode. This isn't the reboot's only weird take on their friend zone either, strangely enough, but more on that later. So this is the best joke, Dale's plan to make the rat easier to catch. It mainly comes down to the delivery and animation that go alongside it. Honestly, this episode just wasn't that funny.
First thing we gotta do is make him lazy.
Wait.
For some perspective, this is the episode that convinced me to give this video the title I gave it. I thought the first episode of the reboot was bad, but this episode is legitimately demoralizing, uncomfortable, and just weird. We start with Bobby and the lefty chick from the previous episode at a funeral after a customer died. As the man's son speaks about how badly he wishes he had spent more time with his late father, Bobby starts to realize that he should avoid making the same mistake, and the three, yes, side shave comes along, go to a football fantasy camp. They also have dinner together too, with a really weird moment where she spoon feeds Hank and gets nothing more than a dirty look in exchange. At the camp, Willow manages to be the best player there. They got faster and more agile and better at catching than everyone else, especially Bobby. She's not just liked by everyone in a quirky Reddit chungus, no, this vegan metrosexual chick is actually physically surpassing men who eat protein. Bobby ends up getting metaphorically sidelined as Hank's son, with girl boss Willow taking his place. Oh, and there's also another weird Hank-Willow moment where she catches Hank changing and teases him while making this expression. Later that night, Hank and Bobby try to sneak into Jerry Jones' office to meet him, only to find Willow beat them there and shits on a photo of him right then and there. Yeah, that's the kind of thing I'd expect from Family Guy or Rick and Morty. It's too silly to be dramatic, but it's way too uncomfortable to be funny, so it just sits in this awful middle ground of being a moment that just makes me feel weird. Then Willow talks with the two Hills in the parking lot, turning them into a pair of emotional tampons while she unloads her daddy issues. Given how much she comes across as some sort of untouchable DeviantArt OC, I'm guessing we're meant to feel bad for her. And if that's true, it just shows how out of touch the reboot is with the original show and audience. I mean, seriously, quirky, attractive, super talented character with daddy issues, and the whole A-plot revolves around her. They really couldn't have made a more Wattpad character if they tried, huh? Anyway, Bobby ends up calling it off with her off-screen because he'd rather be with Connie. I guess he didn't learn his lesson about college girls. So that was demoralizing, right? This literal who shows up and manages to outdo Bobby to the point Hank prefers being around her, and then ruins the fantasy camp by expressing her weird daddy issues, completely monopolizing the plot, which, might I remind you, it was originally focused on Bobby wanting to spend time with his dad after being confronted with his mortality. But if you can believe it, this isn't my least favorite part of the episode. It's absolutely awful, but the B-plot manages to be ever so slightly worse. Peggy grows frustrated at how everyone would rather chat on their phone, order things online, and screen visitors with their Ring cameras rather than interact with people. She even finds out one of her favorite stores is closed and the Arlen bystander has sold the spot her musings would go for more ad space. She decides to remedy this by building a book nook, a little lending library in front of her house, to bring people together, face to face. And it works for a time. Everyone gathers to read, chat, and a lemonade stand crops up too. Overall, it's going pretty well, and it was very wholesome to see, especially with all the cynicism and demoralization found in most modern media. Of course, things couldn't go well forever, and Peggy discovers that bedbugs live in the spines of the books in the library and have spread all over Orland through that little library she set up. Naturally, she enlists Dale's help. At this point, it actually started to feel like a King of the Hill episode, albeit briefly. Peggy and Dale have always had a good dynamic, and this is definitely the kind of thing old Peggy would do. Oh, right, because trying to build a community centered around reading is something she's done. Full Metal Dust Jacket. Peggy buys a bookstore and tries to form a book club, only for her to realize there's no interest in books anymore. Dale swoops in and uses the bookstore to sell guns. Just when she's at her lowest and shutters the bookstore, she realizes that the books she was giving away free with guns actually managed to touch some people, and she does finally get that book club she wanted, even if it doesn't look quite like how she imagined. So, how does this episode resolve? Surely it'll follow in the uplifting and cozy footsteps of its predecessor, right? Dale, at Peggy's request, starts feeding all his clients misinformation about where the bedbugs came from. By the way, can I just take this moment to point out how much I despise the mainstream for taking a word with a very specific definition, misinformation, and giving it to the normies to misuse until it became a meaningless buzzword? And here Dale's actually using it accurately, but I just had to get that off my chest. Terms stolen by normies from conspiracy theory communities, many such cases. Anyway, this misinformation turns everyone against each other, and they decide to have a public fight at the Book Nook after the arguing in the app escalates, the app which, for whatever reason, uses the Discord notification sound. They gather up and begin to argue before Dale reveals Peggy's books give everyone bedbugs. She tries to find a silver lining, only for the bedbugs to crawl on her as she throws the book to the ground in disgust. They decide to burn all the books to get rid of the bedbugs. Dale tries to spin this as a positive, everyone is together, right? But Peggy shuts him down. Finally, the camera zooms out to reveal it's being watched on that app. as people denigrate the neighbors and demand they be sterilized, ending the episode. King of the Hill was uncharacteristically didactic for an adult animated sitcom. In other words, a lot of the episodes had morals. Even in the reboot, it does try, and often fails, to have some sort of message. So what exactly is the takeaway of the Book Nook plot supposed to be? Digital communication is superior to meeting face-to-face? Attempts to build community will end in disaster and derision, so we should just isolate ourselves instead? Should we all just become subservient little golems who shun social interaction and sit at home to consume products? Or maybe it's some sort of humiliation ritual, like, see, this is what happens when you try to form bonds with your fellow man. It's nihilistic. It's an outright rejection of the warmth and humanity that made the original show so memorable and beloved. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that's the thing. I don't understand how else I could read it. There's no reasonable interpretation I can come up with where it isn't just a horribly demoralizing message at the end of an already off episode. Easily the worst of the bunch. Weird daddy issues girl boss gets glazed while the show urges you to become a soulless, isolated bugman. The funniest line is right at the beginning with a 1930s reference.
Last time the Germans and Japanese teamed up, I wasn't a fan, but this is delicious.
I call it the axis of flavor.
Kahn and Min celebrate their 30th wedding anniversary to maintain appearances despite being divorced, and they expect Hank and Peggy to keep this a secret. Conceptually, I don't really like this episode. It doesn't really make sense of how the Sufanusenpones were characterized. Yes, Kahn and Min were awful to everyone, but they rarely ever fought together. So the two divorcing, well, not impossible, I guess, comes out of nowhere and is never really explained. You could maybe make the argument that with Connie having left to go to college, they felt they had less of a reason to stay together. I shouldn't need to speculate just to make the episode make sense. Additionally, there's this weird rehash of the Chore episode where Peggy and Hank fight about his ability to lie, I guess. First, he's upset that he was willing to lie for Kahn, but not her. But then it becomes a competition about who's the better liar. It doesn't really add anything, and I think they should have focused more on how much Peggy wants to reveal Kahn and Min's secret to get back at them for being so nasty and condescending. The B-plot focuses on Connie and Bobby, with Bobby catering the anniversary party while also trying to be there for Connie. This is also what eventually leads to the lie being exposed, and then Shane breaks up with Connie. There's a surprisingly wholesome scene where Peggy cheers Connie up that, despite the circumstances being very un-King of the Hill, did have that wholesome, cozy vibe the original series had. And Bobby rizzes up the newly single Connie, and the next day, the guys visit Kahn to cheer him up after he is shunned from the Laotian community. It ends on a sort of ambiguous note, though, which never gets followed up on. Not the worst episode, but the concept as a whole was really out of the blue. There's also a few jokes about Joseph hag-maxing, and apparently Laoma, Kahn's mother, died off-screen. Those are really my only other takeaways. Of course, I can't talk about this episode without talking about Kahn's new voice actor. Ted was also recast, but honestly it took me a while to notice. Now obviously this is part of the push to have characters voiced by people of the same ethnicity. Well, not if they're voicing a white character, of course, then it doesn't matter, you know? That's why Kahn is voiced by a new Laotian American actor now. Oh, wait, his new actor is Malaysian? Yeah, I guess the casting department felt they were close enough and thought all Asians are pretty much the same anyway. Literally the, so are you Chinese or Japanese joke from the first season. Great job, anti-racists. You managed to do the exact opposite of what you set out to do. What a shock. Now, wokeness aside, this new voice actor just can't do the voice Toby Huss did. This isn't just a matter of taste either, because Kahn comes across fundamentally different with his new voice, seeming a lot less immature and a lot less of a psycho friend around Ted. That, combined with how out of character he's written in this episode, makes it really hard to see this as the same Kahn from the original series. The best joke was Hank's opinion on a Cupid Shuffle-esque dance.
I love a dance with clear rules and instructions.
Buckle up, because I have a lot to say here. The episode begins with Hank, Junichiro, and GH all receiving money from a settlement Kahn was posthumously part of. GH uses his share to enroll in a male empowerment boot camp run by an Andrew Tate parody. Hank supports this endeavor at first, viewing it as a character-building opportunity. Yeah, one thing you'll notice about this episode is how uncharacteristically naive he is. Anyway, the two go, and Hank is on board until the group begins to blame women for their issues, like being told they're not tall enough, don't make enough money, or aren't funny enough. GH chimes in with his own frustrations at being friend-zoned, leading Hank into a somewhat tone-deaf speech, explaining that there's nothing GH can get out of a romantic relationship that he can't get out of a friendship, then citing some positive examples of women in his life, and saying that no one else is qualified to speak about them since they're all single. When Hank finds he isn't able to get a refund for the boot camp, he has Dale uncover some dirt on the head of the camp, and it turns out the man-made boot camp was funded by the Tate parody's mom. Oh, and that he wore adult braces too. So embarrassing. Spontaneously, all the men realize that their failures with women were entirely their own fault, with Hank explaining that the only reason women don't respect them is because they haven't done enough to earn it. GH and Hank leave the program, with Hank vowing to make sure GH doesn't end up as bitter and cruel as his father. Even if I look past the specific failures of critiquing the men going their own way movement, this episode doesn't really stand on its own. Firstly, we've already had an episode where Hank realizes that he doesn't want Bobby growing up to be like Cotton, and this episode is generally just that, but a lot more impersonal. Additionally, the resolution fails as both a King of the Hill episode and as satire in general. The resolutions in the original series were generally pretty karmic and set up nicely. Take the Patriot Act, for instance. Hank ends up taking care of a cat for an active service member who gets fleeced by a veterinarian who urges Hank to do what he claims is best for the cat, regardless of the cost. Hank eventually gives the vet a taste of his own medicine when he learns that the clinic has an analyzer that's very slightly out of date, which Hank uses to get the vet to stop pushing more unnecessary treatments on him. It's very satisfying seeing the smug bastard get hoisted by his own petard, and Hank using his own words against him makes the conclusion feel earned and inevitable, in the same way all really tightly constructed stories do. And you can point to many other episodes like this too, because it's a tried and true formula. It's satisfying to see a villain get undone by the same tricks they used against others, and it allows for an underdog victory that doesn't undersell the competence of the protagonist. In this episode though, Eli, that's his name by the way, being funded by his mom comes out of nowhere. It's a total deus ex machina that doesn't even address what it's satirizing. There isn't a moment where Hank uses Eli's philosophy against him. All that happens is a woman we've never seen before shows up and saves the day. There's no argument against what the guy's preaching. It doesn't reveal a fundamental contradiction in his ideology, and it definitely won't convince anyone. To make a credible argument against something, you need to understand it. The writers didn't want to try to understand why the men going their own way movement exists. They just wanted to denigrate it. That's the whole reason this episode ends this way. It isn't meant to change your viewpoint. It's meant to, if you identify with the struggles of the men in this episode, humiliate and degrade you. Otherwise, it's assumed you already agree with it, and it'll clap and laugh along uncritically. It doesn't even pretend to try to see both sides of the conflict. So back to that cat episode, even though the vet was clearly the villain, the show let him make points that do sound fair from the outset. We do love our pets, and yeah, we do want to do whatever is necessary to help them live long, healthy lives. The issue is that how that love can be manipulated by someone greedy who is technically acting in the pet's best interest, but to the point where the benefits are microscopic compared to the cost. This episode, though, there's not a single moment when you're meant to understand why the men feel the way they do. From the get-go, from minute one, you're supposed to see them as a group of bitter, ignorant, socially inept losers. By the same token, the way the men agree with Hank is also awful satire. If you want to try to convince someone that women don't care about how much money you make, your argument shouldn't be, well, this guy wasted his money on swords. That's not addressing the argument, which is a critical part of good satire. That's just creating a straw man to use to bash a movement without the kind of even-handedness and intelligence that the original run made such good use of. There are plenty of men who don't waste their money but are still told they don't earn enough. There are plenty of men who don't lie about their height and are still considered too short. It might make for a funny straw man that all the normies can point at and laugh, but it sure as hell won't be changing any minds. I want to go over some moments in this A-plot because they really illustrate the misunderstandings the writers have here. Well, either misunderstandings or deliberate misrepresentations of the movement. Take your pick. With regards to the friend zone thing, being friends with a woman you like is not the same as being in a relationship with her, and despite what the writers want you to believe, you can respect a woman's choice while still feeling like you were led on or manipulated. Those aren't mutually exclusive. It's not to say that being friends with women is terrible, but if you want to be more than that, then yeah, it's completely understandable to not want to be just friends. And it's a fundamentally different bond, and it'd also mean you'd be expecting to support her being in a relationship with someone else. Plus, it's not really committal in the same way a romantic relationship is, and there's a whole sexual reproductive aspect that'd be missing, but I won't get into that since it's not really within the scope here. More pressingly, though, is Hank's examples of positive women. He lists Peggy, his mom Tilly, and an unnamed propane delivery woman that doesn't actually exist. The thing is, Peggy and Tilly, while undoubtedly good people at heart, are no less valuable than men. There are plenty of examples in the series of them not being there for Hank when they should be, or not reciprocating the respect they receive. My point being that all the characters in the show make mistakes, do selfish things, and occasionally treat other people unfairly. Yes, even the women. That's why King of the Hill is a great show. The characters felt human and nuanced. Good people could do bad things, and bad people could do good things. This episode here is fundamentally at odds with the entire basis of the character rating, because it posits that all women will always treat men fairly if treated fairly themselves, when in both reality and King of the Hill, that isn't always true. And as for the B-plot, it would be wholesome if it wasn't so predictable and boring. Peggy ends up having panic attacks during her MRI procedure operated by a very diverse doctor, of course, which are actually caused by her fears that Bobby will abandon her. Eventually, Bobby shows up and the scan goes off without a hitch. There's also this really weird scene with pencil fighting. I have no clue if that's a real thing, but it made me feel nothing except confusion. The only amusing part is Peggy telling her son, "You just got pegged."
You just got pegged.
So, would it surprise you to learn this is my second favorite episode? The moral and concept is incredibly woke, tone-deaf, and absolutely written without a shred of self-awareness. But there are actually moments in here that made me laugh, if not for the reason the writer intended. You know, I got a comment on my YouTube Shorts review that said I could fit in as a character in this episode, and honestly, that's the best hate comment I've ever received. I recognize I can be overly sexist and bitter, and yeah, I've had plenty of failures with women in the past. I do see myself in some of these scenes, and you know what? That's hilarious. I'm watching and I'm thinking, and yeah, if you exaggerated the kinds of things I believe, maybe it would sound a little absurd. I still stand by my beliefs, of course, but I'm not so uptight that I can't laugh at myself once in a while. I think if you can't, it's a sign that what you believe is incredibly dogmatic and austere and probably can't stand up to scrutiny. The thing is, the woman who wrote this, yeah, this episode was written by an ex-Velma writer. I don't think she can laugh at herself or even look at herself through a critical lens. The way this episode is written, women never do anything wrong. They are perfect, and there's never a reason to be upset with one. Every issue a man has with a woman is a man's fault, no exceptions. You have to be intensely politically brain-rotted and have a horrific lack of self-awareness to write something like this. But she did write for Velma, so I guess I shouldn't be shocked, huh? But yeah, terrible episode that manages to be great for all the wrong reasons. The funniest line in terms of things that are meant to be funny was Hank misunderstanding the kinds of videos GH is watching and giving him a reality check.
It's natural, but it's setting up unrealistic expectations. Most repairmen won't accept payment in anything other than cash.
Boomhauer, Dale, and Bill start a wild hog-killing business with Peggy investing money. Hank holds off on investing, feeling uneasy at how quick everything seems to be moving. Buck Strickland ends up getting in on it too, and it starts to seem like Hank is the only one who isn't making bank from the business. As a whole, it doesn't feel like a King of the Hill episode, but especially the moment where Hank gets kicked out of his own kitchen since he isn't an investor, which felt a lot more like Family Guy. Following that moment, Hank gives probably the only funny line of the episode.
I don't know how to kick someone's ass over Zoom, but I'll figure it out if you try to put me out of my own kitchen.
During a celebration of the company's acquisition, he steps into the bathroom, recreates the Silent Hill 2 opening, and then invests his share of his and Peggy's retirement fund. He finds out almost immediately that the stock crashed. Later that night, he meekly tells Peggy that he went against his own advice and invested, then lost the money. Turns out Peggy sold her shares before it crashed, so the status quo is preserved. As for the B plot, Bobby and Connie start dating, first going to a Beethoven concert where Bobby says the word subreddit, and the two fall asleep, and then to a trampoline park where some kid breaks Connie's arm. The episode tries to spin all this like they're having trouble connecting since they're trying to relate more to how each other were in the past as opposed to how they are now, but none of what we saw lines up with that. Like that concert, it would be understandable to come to this conclusion if just Bobby fell asleep while Connie was having a good time, but they both fall asleep. And at the trampoline park, they both felt uncomfortable surrounded by kids, but both ended up enjoying the moment anyway, or at least until Connie broke her arm. They've been pretty emotionally in sync the whole time, just going on crappy dates. The writing tries to paint it like they aren't connecting emotionally, when there's really not anything in this or any previous episode that supports that. Anyway, Connie gets high on painkillers, and they have a final conversation where they resolve to try to connect better. Why did the writers juice her up for this scene? No clue. It doesn't really make it funny, and it undermined what could have been a genuine conversation. But the reboot doesn't really have a lot of sincerity behind it, so I shouldn't be surprised. Man, what a nothing burger of an episode to end on. It's just a truly bland, painful experience, much like the rest of this reboot. Season 14 of King of the Hill is a vacuous, boring experience that will fail at making you feel pretty much anything except irritation and demoralization. I wasn't expecting it to be anything other than trash, but even so, I was surprised at just how hard it failed. It wasn't the locust thing on the air, but what it lacks in political propaganda, which it does have by the way, it makes up for in sheer incompetence on the part of the writers. Obviously, King of the Hill written in current year is never going to feel like King of the Hill. This doesn't even feel like good TV. If the plots were well constructed and the jokes were funny, it could at least stand on its own even if it didn't match the style of the original, but it can't even manage that. I guess if you're curious about how I'd rank the episodes, I'd probably put them from worst to best as Any Given Hill Day, A Sounder Investment, Return of the King, the beer story, Bobby gets grilled, chore money, chore problems, new ref in town, Kahn-scious Uncoupling, no Hank left behind, and Peggy's Fadeout. It's really tough to rank them though, because they're pretty much all bad and in very similar ways too. Anything outside of the best two and the worst one could be swapped around depending on my mood. They don't leave a strong impression, and what impression they do leave is rather negative. You're far better off watching the original, with a noticeable number of the reboot episodes just sort of being inferior versions of these old episodes anyway. If you really want to see the new ones, I still wouldn't bother. Assuming you've watched through my whole review, there's really nothing to gain from seeing it. The fact that the episodes were so easy to summarize in a few sentences should be proof enough. And as for the jokes, finding a good one from each episode is pretty difficult, so don't think I shortchanged the show's comedy angle either. So yeah, supposedly season 15 is coming next year, with the episodes having at least started production at the same time as the season 14 ones, but nothing concrete has been announced as far as I know. I'm sure if there is a season 15, it's going to be more slop, and I'm sure since I'm a masochist, I'll make myself sit through it, if only to gawk at how poorly the studio can misunderstand what the original show is all about. Anyway, that's all for this video. Do the things the algorithm likes, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.